Omelette's guest this morning really needs no lengthy introduction. All that need be said is, here's Art Linkletter.
Thank you.
You're a very warm, a very personable person, and you've had so many years of experiences with people and children. Are there any that really stand out as meaningful to you?
Of course, after 40 years, the most important thing I've learned is that people are totally unpredictable, and you can never be sure of what's going to happen. And some of my most memorable experiences are with people who completely defied all of my anticipatory interview questions, like Dr. Richter, the famous expert on earthquakes, who, when I asked him if he could predict when the next earthquake would be, blew up, swore, and left the studio. A nice, mild-mannered little... And I figured that what the truth was, that here was a man who knows more about earthquakes than anybody in the world, but he can't answer the most important question anybody wants to know. When's the next one? And it bugged him.
You came from a very religious background. I know your father was a Methodist minister. Is that
Baptist.
Correct? Well, that's even a little bit more stern there. What did he think about the career you made for yourself, or was he aware of it?
He wanted me to be a preacher, and he was happy about my career, but he was very unhappy about my first sponsor. My first big sponsor on the West Coast was Roma Wine, and my father used to give the most tremendous sermons about wine and booze that you ever heard. And all of a sudden, there's his son.
You had to do the commercials,
I
too?
did the commercials, so he went back to the Bible, of course, which any good preacher will do, and he found where Jesus turned the water into wine at the wedding, and where Jesus said a little wine is good for thy stomach. And so, you know,
he came to terms
with
it.
He papered it over.
Omelette is the name of our show, and from time to time we interview kids, and you had such a great relationship and still have, I'm sure, with them. Are there any tips you can give me on how to get them to loosen up? We have some that are just all over the studio until the lights go on, and then they go back to yes and no.
I think that the most important thing is to, of course, your attitude. A child, my secret was that the children were on the same intellectual level as I was, so they talked right to me. I never talked down to them, and I never talked up to them, and I generally had some question that I knew would hit a target. I knew something about the children. They didn't know that I knew, but I had them briefed.
Yes, you used to get notes, didn't you?
I had notes from the teacher. Our children were picked up in the morning and driven around, and she would be interviewing them without them even knowing it. And if she found out that little Joey collected bugs, that's what I hit. And I'll never forget one little boy, I said, "What do you do?" He says, "I collect bugs." And I said, "Well, how do they look?" He says, "Right through their eyes."
Can't top that. Well, what did you do when you'd have some that were very reticent and very shy? Would you go on to the next child?
Yes.
Because sometimes they will just break down in tears, won't they?
Yes, you can't persist and pursue a child who has suddenly retreated into his shell. I just go on and get another one.
I did some brief teaching, and I actually used a record that you were very close to in the teaching of the class, and I know you know what I'm speaking of.
Yes.
It was the record after your daughter's death.
We Love You, Call Collect?
Yes, yes, to get the response. And
Yes.
I was a little concerned about some of the films we used at that time. They talked about the aspects that sort of glamorize drugs to a certain extent, and you have a difficulty there where you can overdo it.
Yes,
if it looks that appealing,
we
anybody
have
might try
we have
it.
learned a lot in the last 3 years about drug abuse prevention in schools. Number one, you can't make it so horrible that it's fascinating. You never scare most kids out of it anyway. And number two, you can't just tell kids about drug abuse and leave it to their good judgment. You can't just give them facts. And you can't threaten them.
So what do you do?
Well, what you do, you accept the fact that there are drugs in the world and people have always used them, and that there are good and bad things about drugs, just as there is about fire or speed in automobiles. And you tell young people that that's part of growing up, to learn how to handle these, and that turning to drugs when there are problems is like putting a crutch under your arm. You'll never learn to walk or run if you don't do it by yourself, and drugs are a cop-out.
What is your response to parents sometimes that think, well, the way to win their confidence and everything is to sit down maybe and smoke some pot with them?
Well, I tell parents the two worst things they can do is to put kids down severely when they use drugs, or to join them. You have to be between those two.
Are you optimistic about, I know you're very involved in the work, and I saw you recently on a network show, and you said
Yes.
your whole approach really has changed. Does this involve with what you were just saying?
Yes, the approach of drug education today and drug abuse prevention has changed, and we are optimistic. A lot of good things have happened. First of all, it's no longer as in as it was. It's no longer an epidemic in proportion. Secondly, we're getting a better grip on the distribution of everyday drugs, which up to a couple of years ago could be purchased and were in most medicine cabinets. I'm talking about barbiturates and amphetamines, two of the worst drugs, in many ways as bad as heroin, and much more available and in so many medicine cabinets. Also, we are learning that there are really no drug problems, there are people problems. And what is important is to love and care and communicate and make people feel meaningful about life. Then they don't go to drugs.
Do you have answers for some parents that are oversensitive, or they take too much of the fault on their own shoulders? Everything that a child does wrong, it's because of the mother and the father.
That's wrong, but it's human. Parents too often take the blame for everything when actually a great deal of it is peer pressure. We're living in a time when youngsters are doing wild and crazy things, and they always have, but there are more wild things to do today than there were when I grew up. And parents shouldn't be too sensitive about taking it all on themselves, unless they are a bad example. A father who comes home every Saturday night loaded, and a mother who doesn't go to bed at night without pills or wake-up pills, they should take a look at the mirror.
What's your reaction to the religious cults and so many young people now turning to that instead of drugs, or they've been on drugs and then they turn to
I
that?
think it's good.
Do you think it's a fad?
I think it's partly a fad, and I think many of them are turning to religion as a high, as a trip. But it's better than drugs. And I would choose that over drugs anytime, and it might be a bridge over to more sensible application of religion. And some of these youngsters who are pretty far out in the religious field, like the street Christians and Jesus freaks and others, are very sincere.
But so many of the leaders of some of those cults are suspicious characters, I should say.
They are. Some of them are. But I would rather have my child into a religious trip than a drug trip.
What's your basic philosophy of life, and has it changed in the last, say, 10 years?
No, I'm an optimist. I believe essentially that people are good, not bad. I think that life is getting better. I think in spite of occasional fallbacks and the tensions of this present society creating unnatural feelings within people, that we are getting better. And I have great confidence in the young people. I think the ones we read about are the tiny minority, and the ones we aren't reading about are so much better than anybody has ever been, that I think they're going to handle the future.
That sounds great to hear. What about your own marriage? I know it's been a long, long-lasting and one of the successful ones. Is that because of your religious background?
No, I think that basically my wife and I are both even-tempered people. We don't fly off the handle. We don't become unreasonable. I have a great sense of humor, so that nothing gets too tense.
That's wonderful.
And I think that's very important. We never go to sleep at night angry or unspeaking, or of course we've been lucky. We've been healthy, and we've had a good career, and we've had a happy family. But on the other hand, living in Hollywood's not all that easy either. But I think it's mostly compromise. Another way to spell marriage is compromise. And if you don't compromise and accept the fact that you're not always going to agree on everything, you're not going to get along.
How can you tell other people how to use compromise?
It's very difficult. I think maturity is another important word. Many people are children and never grow up emotionally. And so their tantrums and their own selfishness and their own unreasonableness makes marriage almost impossible. Just as 9 out of 10 teenage marriages are breaking up today, so many other marriages are breaking up because people don't grow up. They're not mature.
How do you explain so many marriages that last for 20 years? And then it's a combination of reasons, I'm sure.
Yes. Some of those, of course, are religious. Some of them are old-fashioned. Some of them are because there are children. Some of them are because people just are going to make the best of things without expecting marriage to be perfect, without expecting the other person to be everything. If I ever met another person who was everything in the world, I'm sure they'd find that I was flawed.
You make a lot of appearances and you travel a great deal. What is the general gist of your talks when you appear before groups?
Well, about a third of my talks are on drug abuse and the American family. About a third are on salesmanship. And about a third are on what's right with America. I talk at a lot of Chamber of Commerce dinners talking about the good things about America. And it's high time that we stood up for ourselves. Too many people are knocking everything. And I travel all over the world. In a couple of days now, I'll be in Africa, in India, Cambodia. I travel 150,000 miles a year. And anybody who travels that much says, hip, hip, hooray for America.
Thank you. That's a great note to end on. Art Linkletter. We'll be back with more of Omelette right after this.